Don't worry. I'm going to start again anyway. Last lesson was awareness, the seventh principle. So we went through all the concept of awareness and the journey of awareness, the journey of growing self-awareness in the journey of life, culminating in the universe becoming self-realized, and through conscious beings, and then those conscious beings, their individual awareness merges with universal awareness, and that's what self-realization is. So this lesson, you've had a bit of a break, so we're not going to go easy on you this lesson. This lesson is going to be like a hammer. This is quite a meaty lesson. So this lesson is following on from the awareness, the seventh principle lesson, and we're going to talk more about awareness, but we're going to talk about it in a universal sense, and we're going to look at how the universe actually works. And this lesson is called the Universal Trinity. And I say that it's a bit of a hammer lesson because it can be quite complex to grasp, and it's a bit of a mind twister. So I want to mention that before we start. For some of you, this is going to be the first time that you've seen this concept, maybe. And so, don't necessarily feel that you've got to understand and take everything on board immediately, because there's going to be a lot of information going at you. So it might take a bit of time for it to sink in. That's perfectly natural. You might want to go and watch the video again, or you might want to do a repeat next year and do the lesson again. It's an ongoing thing, understanding the Universal Trinity, to be honest with you. So that's why it's a bit of a hammer lesson. So buckle up and let's talk about the Universal Trinity. And Krishnamurti's coming really close to me now. I think it's because he likes the subject. He's making me shake. All right, let me try and crack on. So the Universal Trinity. Now we represent this Universal Trinity concept with a diagram, because that's the easiest way. We put everything on a diagram. All the information goes on a diagram. So we're going to take you through a journey of what this diagram actually represents. But first of all, let's just say a couple of things about the word Trinity, because as many of you know already, the concept of a Trinity exists in many different religions and spiritual philosophies since religion really began. I wouldn't say all of them, but many of them include a concept of a Trinity. Like, for example, the Christian Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and the Hindu Trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Now we can talk about, if we have time, maybe we can talk about them a little bit at the end of the lesson, once we've taken you through this concept. But this is, the reason why these exist in religions and spiritual philosophies is because they are metaphors for the universe. They are a description of how the universe actually works. Now, of course, in religions, they get, over the centuries and thousands of years, they get convoluted, and they twist and turn, and they lose meaning, and meaning gets added in, and it's sort of a bit of a rolling process, and so it can be quite hidden. The true meaning can be quite hidden, but this stuff came through people's intuition throughout the ages, from higher minds. So there's grains of truth throughout all of these philosophies. So we call it the Universal Trinity because it applies universally. It is a diagram, or it is a concept which is how the universe works. So that applies everywhere, to the whole universe. And if we're talking about parallel universes, which there are parallel universes, it applies to all of them. The universe is one, really. We're not going to talk about parallel universes in this lesson. Don't worry, that was just an addition. And the second thing I want to talk about here is the relevance of this to this course, because this lesson is going to be a little bit abstract in a way. It's going to be a little bit of a mind twister and a thought process. So it's going to be a little bit abstract. It's not practical. It's not really possible to apply it to healing or anything. It's more like knowledge. But that is very important to network healers. And one of the biggest reasons why this particular knowledge is important to network healers is because you guys are going through the process of self-realization. Now, part of the process of self-realization is that the source needs to understand itself. It needs to have knowledge of itself. And the only way that the source can do that is through conscious beings and culminating in the journey of self-realization. So self-realization is all about the universe, first of all, knowing, first of all, realizing itself as awareness. And then after that, it has to start to know itself in a self-realized state. So think of it like the source is looking out of your eyes. Pure awareness, self-realized awareness is looking out of your eyes and understanding this. And you're looking at yourself in a way, and you're understanding yourself, the universe, how the universe works. Okay, so let's get into it. So this is the diagram that we're going to take you through. Now, this is looks very complex to start with, and this is the end result. This is what we're working to in this lesson. We're going to simplify it completely so we understand all the steps involved. But just to show you at the start, this is the full diagram of the universal Trinity. But let's simplify it down and start at the beginning. So the universe is made of cycles. Everything in the universe is made of cycles. And this is a well-known phrase, really. But it's really true. I mean, it's literally true as well. The information which manifests into the physical universe of form is made of cycles. The language which is used in that information is all made of cycles. That's why that you can see cycles everywhere in the universe at every single level. So let's look at the actual main cycle of the universe. So these are the symbols that we're going to use for the universal Trinity. And there are 3 of them because it's a Trinity. However, when you expand on this, there's lots and lots more different steps. So, but we can simplify it down. We can boil it down to a Trinity just to make it simple to start with. So let's look at these symbols. So that is an infinity symbol, isn't it? And that is the symbol that we use for the source, the non-physical source. And actually it's made of 7 types of awareness. Now we're going to go through those 7 types of awareness a bit later on in the lesson. But this is the non-physical source. Now the non-physical source creates acacia. Acacia is also non-physical and it's information. So out of the non-physical source is born a load of information, a flow of information. And that's the symbol on the red. That's the symbol that we use for acacia. By the way, if any of you know the term acacia as pronounced as akasha, then akasha is technically the right way of pronouncing it if you take the Sanskrit, the modern interpretation of the Sanskrit word. So a Sanskrit purist, the language Sanskrit, would pronounce it akasha. But I pronounce it acacia because I think that that's how we used to pronounce it back in the day, all those thousands of years ago when it was invented. But anyway, moving on. So acacia is non-physical information. And then acacia then manifests into energy. So the information blueprint of the universe, you could say, manifests into energy. And that includes everything in the universe, everything that is around us, everything that we can perceive. And energy is created with a separation to it. Now, this isn't the first time you've heard this, of course. Been talking about this for a long time now in this course. It's created with positive and negative. That's a separation. And there's movement to energy. All energy is information in movement. Non-physical information, when it starts to move, it becomes energy. And that creates time and space as well with it, and matter and all forms of energy. So let's look a little bit closer at this energy symbol of positive and negative. So now it's just starting to get a bit more complex, but basically in this section of energy, you've got magnetic fields. So magnetic fields are produced, which is really the construct of the whole universe. And that's our little symbol in there, a plus and a minus with little wiggly lines. That's to show that a magnetic field is vibrating. It's vibrating positive and negative energy. And magnetic fields are the basis to everything. In fact, even empty space is made of a magnetic field type of energy. And then time and space is born from magnetic fields. So when I say time and space, that is time and then spatial dimensions, width and breadth and depth or length. That's where we exist in the physical universe of form. And matter, of course, is produced as well. That's atoms. That's separated positive and negative energy, protons and neutrons. That's what this physical stuff is made of, atoms. But when energy is when energy is manifested, it is manifested with an inherent need to unify. It's got an inherent need to balance the duality, the separation, and come together and unify. That's what energy wants to do. Throughout the journey of energy in the universe, it always wants to unify and go still. I'll come back to that in a second. So let's go back to the diagram again. The source creates acacia. So we can add another step in there, creation, in between the source and acacia. And we can also add the step in between acacia and energy, which is manifestation. And very importantly, the step in between energy and the source, this is a very important step because this completes the cycle. That's called absorption, because energy absorbs back into the source. Now, what happens when energy absorbs back into the source? Why is this so important? Well, it creates awareness and peace in the source. This is what creates a conscious universe. So the little white dot is our symbol for awareness. That's a recognized symbol for consciousness, by the way. We talked about that in the last lesson with the symbols in the awareness symbol, if you remember. And peace, the Trinity of dots, the banner of peace, that's a symbol for peace. So when energy absorbs back into the source, it creates awareness and peace in the source. Now, we can use a little analogy to wrap our heads around this. And we're going to use the analogy of a little girl making a milkshake. So the little girl is the non-physical source. And she starts to create a milkshake. She wants a milkshake, so she starts to create a milkshake. And she starts pouring in all the ingredients. So that's creation and acacia. That's the ingredients getting put in to the milkshake. And when the milkshake is completely made, fully ready to go, that's energy. The whole of the physical universe. Then the little girl starts to drink the milkshake. And as she drinks the milkshake, she gets that sugar rush. That really energetic sugar rush of drinking a drink with sugar in it. Well, that's the metaphor for absorption. She's absorbing that milkshake, but the sugar rush is the awareness. So the source is absorbing that energy, and as a result, it creates that light of awareness in the source. Makes it a conscious universe. Another important thing to mention here is that it's the dissolution of the awareness which triggers creation. So energy is absorbed into the source, creates awareness, and then that awareness sort of dissolves away, but that triggers more creation. So it carries the cycle on, basically. So this is the diagram that we've just gone through, basically. So non-physical source creates akashic information, which manifests into the physical world of form, energy. Energy always gets rid of its separation, goes still, unifies, and when it does that, it absorbs back into the source and it creates peace and awareness in the source. But it's also triggering another cycle of creation. So that's the first step. That's the first step of the Universal Trinity, understanding that bit. But this also seems abstract, really, to start with, until you start putting it into a sort of a framework. And let me give you a few examples of where this process is actually happening in the universe, because it's happening everywhere. The whole universe is made of this cycle. So, for example, the smallest case of this happening is in empty space, the vacuum energy of empty space. Now, we've talked about this when we talked about anatomy and the structure of magnetic fields. Do you remember we talked about how a magnetic field is positive and negative energy, bubbles like that, vibrating very, very, very quickly until it's just like a little vibration. That's what a magnetic field is. Now, in that magnetic field, so this applies to all magnetic fields, but I use the example of empty space because that's the highest frequency. It's the smallest bubbles. Now, what's actually happening there is that energy, positive energy, is created and then absorbed. And then the negative energy is created, then absorbed. So this cycle is actually going on in that little play of positive and negative energy. Creation and absorption, creation and absorption. That's this cycle going round. So that's happening in empty space. You know what that means? That means that there is awareness in empty space. Now that goes along with a growing body of intuition or knowledge in the world, that awareness is everywhere. And really, I suppose that also ties in with the religious thought of God being everywhere in all things, because this cycle is actually happening everywhere and it's creating awareness everywhere. However, don't forget, that's not self-awareness, that's just awareness. That doesn't mean the source is self-aware, it's just awareness which is everywhere. So that's the smallest example. There is the biggest example of this happening in the universe is great universal cycles. And what I mean by that is that the whole universe goes on a journey, a cycle, and then it starts again. Now, this is kind of on the edges or beyond, this is kind of beyond what science and physics knows, of course, but this has been known for a long time as well in many ancient cultures. For example, in Hindu culture, it's called the breath of Brahman, the breathing cycle of the universe. So the universe is born, and then it expands and expands and expands and expands and expands, and then it dissolves, and then it's born again, and it's just a big breathing cycle. So that's this cycle actually happening to the whole universe. Energy is created from acacia, goes on a cycle, a journey of life. The whole universe goes on a journey of life. And then the energy absorbs back into the source, and then it triggers more creation. So it's happening on all levels and everything in between. And we're going to talk about some more examples of how this cycle is happening in a minute. The great universal cycle is trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of years. In fact, no one really knows. Science doesn't know how long the universe is going to exist for. There's lots of people who put predictions out. But, all we need to know is the number is so big, it's difficult to comprehend. But it is finite, but it's a number of trillions and trillions and trillions of years, basically. But the other example, the first example that I used, the empty space one, well, that is going so fast that actually you can't measure it. Now, this is known to science. This is underneath what is called the Planck length, underneath the lowest measurement of time. So really, it's almost underneath time, how quickly those bubbles are going. So in terms of time, everything in between these cycles are happening at all sorts of different levels, also different sizes, all sorts of different times, everywhere in the universe. Okay, so this formula can be, this cycle can be expressed as a formula. So I just want to show you this in case you see this formula anywhere, that really it's just the same thing. It means the same thing as what you've just looked at. So on the left, starting on the left there, the non-physical source, you could say theoretically starts in a state of non-awareness. That's why it's not got the little peace and awareness in it. That's theoretical. I'll explain why in a second. But the non-physical, non-aware source creates acacia, that's the red triangle. And then that manifests into energy, that's the yellow bit in the middle, subtle energy, space, time, matter. And then through the unification process of energy, it produces, and through absorption, it produces an aware, peaceful source. That's when the little symbols go into the infinity sign, the little white dot and the little banner of peace, 3 green dots. And that's created awareness and peace in the source. And then that awareness dissolves into a non-aware source, which then goes back to the beginning again. Now, the non-aware source is in brackets there, really only to show that that's only theoretical, because that bit doesn't actually happen. Because this cycle is happening all the time, everywhere, there's always a constant flow of awareness. Do you see what I mean? So think about this cycle as little circles, for example. Lots and lots of little circles. Well, imagine the whole universe full of big circles, medium circles, little circles. It's happening everywhere. All of them are dishing out a constant flow of awareness. So really, there's never any time where the universe is not aware. Awareness is always there. It's infinite and eternal. So this particular diagram, which can be summarized here with a key, I'm going to upload into Google Classroom so you can have a look at this formula and the key to the formula at your leisure. All right, and now's a good time for any questions. How's it gone so far? Okay, let's move on then. So now going back to this diagram. This diagram is exactly what you've just been looking at. It's just there's a lot more information on it, that's all. Now, we're not going to go through every single bit of information on this diagram. In this lesson, we just want to give you a gist so that you understand the diagram, generally speaking. So let's look at the diagram and follow the diagram around in the same way that we've just done with the cycle. So let's start with energy. And obviously you can recognize you can obviously recognize the different symbols now, can't you? You've got the infinity symbol of the source, the non-physical source. You've got the red triangle of acacia, and you've got the yellow bit of energy. So let's look at energy just quickly. So this little face that you can see, and it is designed to be a face as well, because the evolution of conscious beings in the universe is within the energy part of the Trinity. So on the right-hand side, its left eye, you could say, that's magnetic fields. So inside that little oval, you can see a red and a black dot. That's positive and negative energy. We're starting to use the right colors for it now, red and black. So that's symbolizing a magnetic field. That's the positive and negative energy bubbles that are constantly vibrating within a magnetic field. And then on the left, you can see matter. Now that is a representation of an atom. And in an atom, you have an electron, you have a proton, and you have a neutron. So that's all represented within that particular oval. Now I'm going to leave it there because there's no need to go further into those bits and bobs. That's probably for another time. But in the forehead of this face, in the head area, you can see that I've labeled it still. That is showing that the route that energy takes throughout the cycle and throughout the universe is that it gets rid of its separation. It goes still, becomes unified, then it gets absorbed into the source. That's what it wants to do. That's what energy wants to do all the time. Okay, so that's the energy bit. Now, we're going to spend a bit more time on this one because absorption is really important, isn't it? Because absorption creates awareness. That's how awareness is generated. And there's more than one type of awareness. I said that at the start of this lesson, didn't I? And the reason is because there's more than one type of absorption. Now we can actually start to apply this, practically speaking, in the universe and see examples of different types of awareness in the universe. So let's have a look at these different types of awareness. Do you see the lines which are going from energy into the source? There's quite a few different lines, different colors, but all these lines are going into the source. These are the different absorption routes. So let's go through them one by one, just so we've got an idea of these different types of awareness. Let's start with the one on the left, and we can call that black hole absorption or gravitational absorption. Now, we don't need to spend much time on this particular one, just so that you know that there are black holes in the universe. You've probably heard of black holes. Black holes are the result of matter which sticks together through gravity, clumps together, and then collapses on itself and forms black holes. It's actually stars that go supernova, then collapse on themselves because their gravity is too much, and it forms a black hole. Now, that is one of the ways where energy is trying to get back to itself. So, science and astronomy knows a lot about black holes. So this bit we're adding on, to be honest with you. The bit that the absorption bit is not part of mainstream science, of course, because this whole cycle is not part of mainstream science yet. So in the middle of a black hole, there is absorption going on. Energy is just absorbing back into the source. That's one type, but we don't need to spend too much. That's a little bit too far away to really affect us. The next one, emotional absorption. Okay, so now this is getting more interesting because this applies to everybody, doesn't it? Emotional absorption. Now, if you look at the diagram now, can you see the brown section, or with a bit of green, called mind? There is a section going from energy into the source called mind. And there's actually 4 types of absorption routes that are going through that section. And these are the different types of awareness that need mind. Like we all have, like conscious beings in the universe have evolved mind. So these particular types can only go through mind that has evolved in the universe through the journey of life. And the first one is emotional absorption. So this is when we're feeling an emotion consciously in our awareness filter. And we've talked about the awareness filter, haven't we, in the higher mind, which channels our awareness. Well, subtle energy signals get fed into the awareness filter, and that energy absorbs into the source, in the filter, which is part of your higher mind. So that's one type, emotional absorption. The next type is thought absorption. In the same way, exactly the same way as emotional absorption, our thoughts get absorbed. Subtle energy signals with the programming get fed into the awareness filter, and it absorbs into the source, and we experience it consciously. Awareness of a thought. So that's another type of absorption. The next type, sensory absorption. So this type is coming in from our senses. So what we can see, what we can hear, what we can feel, taste, all of that in the same way as thoughts and emotions, but this is slightly differently. It comes into our awareness filter and it paints a picture. It paints a 3-dimensional picture around us in the awareness filter. And that's a type of awareness. We are aware of our surroundings through sensory absorption. Next one is outside of the mind. I'm going to come back to the mind in a minute, but this one is actually going outside of the mind segment. You can see it's called separated absorption. Now, this is a type of awareness which I talked about earlier. The awareness in empty space, the awareness in magnetic fields. because it's called separated awareness, because positive and negative are separated out. Positive energy bubble is created and absorbed. And then a negative energy bubble is created and absorbed. So it's creating and absorbing separately. It's not unifying at all. And next one, universal absorption. So that's outside of mind as well. Now, I gave you this example as well earlier. This is the great universal cycles. So this is when the universe is born. All of the energy in the universe is born, goes through the journey of the universe. And then at the end of the universe, it's all absorbed again, all together, and then created again. So that's another type of absorption, another type of awareness. Okay, and finally, you could say the most important here. This is the pink route through. The pink route through from energy to the source. Unified absorption. And this is going through mind. This has to go through mind. Now, this has to do with self-realization. So when somebody goes through the process of self-realization, the energy signals going into their awareness start going through in a unified way. And that means that the two halves of duality are coming together, and the duality, the separation, is dissolving. And that actually causes infinite deep peace in the source and self-awareness. This is what allows the process of self-awareness, permanent self-awareness. So that unified absorption, that pink route, that's the goal of the universe. So you could say that's the most important type of awareness, self-awareness of the universe, the whole purpose. And as you can see, if you follow the pink route, it goes over to the emotional absorption and thought absorption, and there's a big T-bar there. That is showing that that's the end of suffering. Because suffering is in emotional absorption and thought absorption. And that unified absorption stops that suffering process. And we'll talk more about suffering a bit later on. Okay, so those are the 7 types of absorption, and therefore the 7 types of awareness. Any questions so far before I move on to the next bit? Yeah, it's interesting you asked that, because last time we presented this, somebody asked that as well. And you're also being made to ask that. It's like the source wants me to say it. Do you know what I mean? And I haven't put it in the lesson, but for some reason I have to keep saying it. And I mean, it is important. It's very important. And as you can see, there is a 1, 2, and a 3 there, and they are actually explosions. They are bangs, and they're conflicts. And as you go through the process of self-realization, you will have 3 particular conflicts personal to you at some point through that journey. And it's the process of this unified absorption route. Now, you can say that on an individual level. You can also say that on a collective level as well, because the whole planet is going through a self-realization process because of all the people on it that are going through self-realization. So the global awakening is a mass self-realization. So you can say that there is a unified absorption route, theoretically, in an abstract way, for the planet. And those 3 conflicts, I think, relate to the global conflicts, which means that we've had 1 and 2 in the last century. This is when the unified absorption route was happening for the planet. And we're about to have the number 3. But that number 3 is the last one before the self-realization or the global awakening. Right. Yeah, so that formula at the start is a very, very simplified way of describing it. And what I meant was about the dissolution of awareness. That doesn't have anything to do with the journey of life or evolution or anything. That's just a simple way of saying that the universe can't be aware unless it creates energy, unless it creates akasha and then energy and then absorbs. But the thing is, it was in brackets, and the reason why it was in brackets was because it doesn't actually happen, because this is happening all over the place, and it's happening all the time, this cycle. So there is always a constant flow of awareness, basically. Do you see what I mean? Anyone else before I carry on? Okay. So moving on with the diagram then. Right then, so moving on then around the cycle, because we are on absorption. So moving across to creation. Now, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on these. I just want to show you the main aspects here. So the source creates. And this is the very first instant of duality. And duality, you can see it depicted here with the circles, red and black. But this is non-physical still, because this is creating acacia. So creation is the very first instance where that separation really exists in non-physical information, where duality itself is born. And then we move to acacia, which is non-physical information. So this is where the acacia is finalized, because acacia grows, the creation grows in many different forms, and then acacia is finalized. And then that acacia is ready to be manifested. By the way, of course, I'm going to upload this diagram separately into Classroom as well, so that you can look at it in your own time as well. So then acacia is manifested. Now, there's a lot going on here, of course, but this is just the process of manifestation. One thing I will just bring up, though, you see there's a mirror in there. I think that the mirror aspect is you could say reflected in many religions, because I've seen this appear in religions and spiritual philosophies, where, for one example, I think is in Christianity, where they say something like God created the world in his image, or something like that. I think that there's an intuition in there referring to this mirror aspect of manifestation. And it's a reversal, it's a flip. You can see the big red positive and the little negative, and then you go the other side of the mirror, and it's the opposite, a big negative and a small positive. It's a mirror image of the acacia. And then it starts to move, and it also creates a negative dominance at this point. This is why the negative symbol is much bigger than the positive one there on the left-hand side. And that negative dominance is actually repeated all the way through the diagram, all the way through energy, all the way through the journey of life, a negative dominance. Now, we talked about negative dominance before, didn't we? In lesson 2, in fact, when we talked about the Aya Guide of Healing. You can always go back to that and watch that video. But the negative energy dominance throughout the universe is what causes suffering, eventually. However, it's also what causes awakening and self-realization. I'm going to talk about suffering more a bit later on, don't worry. So let's move on. So akashic information has been manifested into energy. And then we're back at the start, back where we started. It manifests into magnetic fields and matter and time and space. Okay, so that's actually relates to this particular diagram because this particular diagram is how the universe works, but it's got suffering in it. And I'm going to show you another diagram at the end of this lesson, actually, without suffering in it. Now, one of the things that happens through the process of suffering is that it creates, that there's love that comes back from the source into energy. And while there's suffering in the universe, it's contaminated love. We're just calling it contaminated love, because once you move past this diagram and onto the next, when you become self-realized, you receive uncontaminated love from the universe. So it's the actual suffering, which is what we're calling contamination, and it gets contaminated all the way through the cycle. That's why this particular diagram is the universe in a state of suffering, really. And it's that universe, it's that unification route which causes self-realization. And then we move on to another diagram, which I'm going to show you later on. Yes. Yeah. Well, absolutely. I didn't really explain what contaminated love is. So yeah, thank you. Yeah. Contaminated love is love plus a negative emotion. Anyone else got any questions? No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. And the issue is sometimes in some sects of Christianity, they take that too far, don't they? It's in many Orthodox Christianity, especially I know in Russia, or Russian Orthodox, I think the whole idea of suffering is central to the whole universe. But people have taken it too far and believe that they should only live with suffering. So there is nothing else but suffering. So suffering is life, and that's one and the same, and can never end. Yeah, yeah. You don't need to add any more, do we? Okay, then. So moving on, and let's talk about the universal Trinity as a universal language, because this cycle is actually a language as well. Now, let me just show you on the diagram that basically acacia is the information which generates the whole universe. Now, you can describe each one of these sections with a different language, and I'm not going to go into it too much. I'm just going to show you the acacia one, because the akashic language is very important, because acacia is the information which generates the whole universe. And if I just zoom in to the side there, you can see that right on the side there, it's called geometric acacia flow. That's the name of the language of acacia. And actually, it is this cycle. That language is this whole cycle. And you can make a language out of it. And I won't go into that right now anyway, because there's not enough time. But you can actually turn this diagram into a language. And that's geometric acacia flow. And that's actually the language of how the cycles of acacia are generated. And it's also the language of the astral dimensions as well. And it's also the language in between. It's the language that higher minds use as well. That's why there's always a twist, a metaphorical twist, because this is actually a language of metaphors. So if we can understand this language, we can understand the cycles of the universe. And that means understanding the future. Have you ever wondered why our higher minds can have knowledge of the future? How they can have knowledge of the future? The reason is because if you can understand this language, you can predict what's coming next. And that's what higher minds do. They download acacia from the akashic stream, and they interpret it, and they can actually see what's coming next, because the universe is infinitely deterministic. So this is an infinitely deterministic language, geometric acacia flow. This whole cycle turned into a language. So let's just talk about determinism. And you would have seen some of these slides already, so it's a bit of a reminder. Determinism means, in a way, predetermined. That everything has a causal chain which created it. So really, put simply, determinism is set in stone. The future is set in stone, the past is set in stone. So to explain that, I'm going to go back to the analogy of a movie screen. Do you remember this? So this little square in here is the picture that the movie is playing on the screen. And the analogy is that this is the whole universe. The whole universe is a movie being played on a screen. So in the old-fashioned way of projecting a movie, there is a projector, isn't there? And there is a strip of film which is being fed through that projector. And that's what's producing the picture on the screen. So the film strip is information. The film strip is actually acacia, akashic information. So that's what this little strip is here, symbolizing the film which is being run through the projector. But it's made of akashic information, which is geometric acacia flow, which is that cycle, that whole Trinity cycle made up into a language. So that film strip runs through the projector, and then we get these pictures. We see the universe. The universe is manifested in physical form. And that includes everything in the universe, all of nature, all of life, animals, even cities, of course, civilizations, people, everything, you and me, everything in the universe is all generated from this information, this film strip that's running through the projector, manifesting this picture. So everything in that picture there is in energy. It's being manifested in energy. Now, let's have a quick look at what's coming. So if we've taken the universe, the present moment, over to the right there, and because of the flow, the direction of flow, basically everything to the left there, you could say, is the future. That's what's about to be projected. Now, the reason I'm trying to describe here, the reason why it's infinitely deterministic. Now, that akashic information which is flowing towards the present moment hasn't manifested yet until it manifests in the present moment, the future. Now, it doesn't actually have a start to it. It's being generated infinitely. It never starts. That's why it's going into a little point. And this what you could say is a causeless cause. And this is sometimes how religions refer to God, sometimes as the causeless cause, the only existence in the universe that doesn't have a cause to it. And that fits with this, really, because Acacia is infinitely projected. There's no actual start to it. If you go that way, it's infinite. It's going through lots of different evolutions and growing, and it's still non-physical, but it doesn't actually start. It's always been infinitely generated. Now, if we take it the other way, and we can see that the other side is actually, on the right there, is actually the past. Now, going back to the universal Trinity, the present moment is the universe of form, energy, the manifested energy, and then that absorbs into the source. But the absorption goes on forever, smaller and smaller and smaller. It dissolves very gradually, and that's the past. And it goes back into non-physical information as it absorbs. So that's infinite that way as well. So basically what we've got here is a universe in which there is a manifested present moment in energy, and the past and the future are non-physical but extend infinitely. So this explains the concept of the Akashic records. Have you heard of the Akashic records? I'm sure most of you have. Now, this is a well-known phenomena that's been known about for thousands of years, but I think there's a few misunderstandings about it. Most people think the Akashic records are a storehouse of information somewhere, which hold all of the information or knowledge of the whole universe. Now, that's kind of true, but it's more like a flow. This is the Akashic records, because what you've got is we've got the past and the future infinitely being generated or dissolving. And so that information is always there, infinitely. And it's set in stone. It's the film strip. You can't change the film strip. So this also explains a New Age spirituality concept. Have you heard of this concept that people say that the past, present, and future all exist at the same time? This is a popular thing in New Age spirituality. Well, again, there's a little bit of a misunderstanding with it, but the essence of it is true. Past, present, and future, quite clearly, all exist at the same time. However, many people are thinking that that means all manifested at the same time. So, some people are thinking that their past lives are being lived right now, as well as this one, which I don't think is accurate. It's more accurate to say that there is only one manifested reality, and that's the present moment. And then the past and the future exist in non-physical information. So that really explains, I think, why the universe, or especially the language of Acacia, is an infinitely deterministic language. Set in stone, infinitely. Okay, any questions about that? Yep. Well, let me do this again to show you the movement. So forget about that bit. I'm just going backwards. But if you start there now, the film strip is moving that way. So what is coming on the left is the future, and then it gets manifested, and then it comes out of the projector, which means the stuff on the right is the past. See what I mean? So the cycles are inherent within the language, within the film strip. The cycles, the language of the film strip is cycles, which then manifests into the universe of form, and then you see all these cycles being played out in the universe of form. Because don't forget, this film strip comes from the universal Trinity diagram. So it is cycles. The language is made from cycles. Okay, anyone else? Or should we stop for a break? Let's stop for a break. Lovely. Okay, how are we doing? We almost there? Okay, so now we want to probably talk about the most important part, you could say, of this lesson. The most important part of the universe, even. And we'll start by talking about suffering. Suffering, which then leads to awakening and self-realization. So let's go back to the simplified formula version of the universal Trinity, because one part that we didn't actually talk about was the bit on the top of the diagram. So with this formula, right at the top, can you see the arrows there which shows separation leads to suffering, and then the end of suffering? So that just shows where in this formula suffering actually happens. And it's quite clearly in the orangey yellow, the golden section of energy. Because that's where suffering happens, of course. That's where everything really happens. Everything, awakening, self-realization, it all happens within that particular section. So separation itself leads to suffering because it is the ignorance of one's true nature. It is the ignorance of the source of its true nature. And that journey back to non-duality, that the two halves of separation unifying together, creates self-realization in the source. So on this diagram, suffering is within that energy section, the physical universe, which means that the end of suffering is the next bit, the unification of those two halves, which then creates an aware, peaceful source. Now, when we go through self-realization, this diagram actually changes. Now, I'll just show you on this PowerPoint, and then we've got a bit of time, so I'll go back to both diagrams in a minute and we can discuss the actual differences in the two diagrams. But when you go through self-realization, when a conscious being in the universe goes through the process of self-realization, which is the goal of the universe, that diagram completely changes. But first of all, the first diagram. This is the first diagram that I've been showing you. Now, that unified absorption route, that pink route there, that is what leads to self-realization, as I mentioned before. That type of absorption, which has to go through mind, has to go through a conscious being with mind, actually leads to self-awareness. If you follow that pink unified absorption route up to the white dot in the source, well, that it's got a pink circle around it that simplifies that you find unity and also self-awareness. There's an arrow there, a label called self-awareness there. And on the other side, on the left-hand side, it goes into the source and it creates peace. That's labeled peace with the three green dots. That's the process of self-realization that's starting. Now, once you go through that, you go on to another diagram. And this is the new diagram. So this is a self-realized universe. And there's loads of differences on this diagram. So I'll let you look at that for a second and see if you can notice any of the differences. First of all, the biggest difference that you might notice is that there is no positive and negative energy. If you look in the energy part, there's no red and black. There's no positive and negative. That's disappeared. The love that's coming through from the source is unconditional love. And there are different types of absorption. Now, I think what I'll do here is that I'll just talk a little bit about this, talk a little bit about it, and then I'll finish the PowerPoint, and then we'll come back and I'll share it again where we can zoom in and we can see it better then once we're zoomed in. I can't zoom in on this PowerPoint, but basically there's no positive and negative anymore on this diagram, and there's different types of absorption. There's only the absorption which goes through mind, because this can only happen in a self-realized being in the universe. So it has to have mind. So this type of acacia, this type of universal trinity, only comes through from a ninth chakra into you. And everything's changed. There's no more suffering on this diagram. Emotions change to something else, which I'll talk about in a second. And there's no suffering at all. There's no impurities in any of the cycle. Okay, I'm going to come back to this now. So moving on to the last slide of the PowerPoint, and then we've got a bit of time, so I'm going to bring this up again so that we can look at it in more detail. Okay, so lastly, some definitions of the source, acacia, and energy. So the source is a non-physical collection of 7 types of awareness in one, which is the infinite and permanent foundation of existence, with a purpose of becoming self-aware and realizing itself as infinite deep peace. That's our definition of the source. Acacia is the flow of non-physical, infinitely deterministic information that is created by the source and holds the metaphorical blueprint for the manifestation of the entire universe of form. And energy. Energy, or form, or physicality, is non-physical information in movement, manifested from akashic information for the purpose of producing awareness in the source by way of absorption and allowing the source to become self-aware. So that's our definition of energy. Of course, that's our definition of energy. That is in no way anywhere close to the scientific definition of energy, just so that you're aware, of course. Okay, that's it for the theory. Any questions so far? And at some point we can go back to those diagrams so I can show you the differences between them. But any questions before I carry on? It's actually to create awareness in the source. So let me just take you back to this diagram. Let me show you that one there, where you can see that energy absorbs back into the source, and the purpose is actually awareness. So as energy absorbs into the source, it creates awareness in the source. So that's the purpose. And in fact, if I go back to this one here, you remember the milkshake analogy, where the girl creates the milkshake. The milkshake is energy, and then she drinks the milkshake, she gets that sugar rush. That's the awareness. In the metaphor, that's the awareness. Because when energy is absorbed into the source, it creates awareness. So that's the purpose of absorption. Yeah, so I mean, the evolution of the universe is part of that fixed nature of acacia. So everything that happens is part of that set in stoneness, or the determinism, the infinite determinism. So everything evolves, but that is the plan. So instead of calling it set in stone or determinism, let's just call it the plan. And that also has religious connotations, of course, doesn't it? The plan. But it's true, there is a plan which is an infinite plan, and it is fixed. But all the evolution that happens within it is part of that plan, and it unfolds as we go. There is always the battle between free will and determinism. You know, and this is a hot topic out there in philosophical circles, of course. And you know, it depends on what perspective you are looking from, really. Because if you are in the world and you don't know the future, then the choices you make are your own, because you don't know necessarily the consequences of those choices. So therefore, free will exists. Yeah, absolutely. So think about this, for example. Say you saw a small child on the road and there was a car coming. Well, what would you do? If you didn't do anything that child would get hit. But you are going to do something, of course. So you run into the road, you get the child, and you pick them out of the road, and you bring them to safety. So basically, you have altered the course of what would happen, you could say, right? But that's because you're acting within a framework of free will, and you don't know the future. But if you zoom out and look at it from the source's perspective, let's say, or the universal perspective, you were always going to do that. If you look back in the past, for example, afterwards, and you that's what you did. You went and saved that child. Well, you were always going to. That's what was going to happen. But from your perspective at the time, it felt like you were making a choice and changing the outcome of the future. Yeah. So in fact, in the environmental disaster that the world is going through is part of the plan, because it's part of the global awakening, but it's actually part of the crash just before the global awakening. We talked about that with the number 3 bang, the conflict. As part of that global awakening, there is a crash in the planet, which has to happen. It's the same as the third world war that's coming. It's the same as the environmental disasters. It's what has been prophesied in so many spiritual traditions, which quite often they've called it the end of the world. And in Christianity, the book of Revelations, for example. So it's that crash and conflict just before the flowering of self-realization, and that's moving from an age of suffering of the planet into the golden age of self-realization of the planet. So it's in between the two planetary cycles, planetary ages. So unfortunately, all that crap that is happening, and there's more of it to come before it flowers, but that is unfortunately part of the plan, and that is another aspect of surrender. If you're going through self-realization, to be able to accept that all that actually does have to happen, because there's no changing it. Well, let's have a look a little bit more at this, the first diagram, the universe in suffering. And what did I want to show you? I think maybe go back to, just to remind you about the different types of absorption to start with, and which ones go through mind. Now, you can see that the ones that go through mind are the ones that we experience, of course: emotional absorption, thought absorption, sensory absorption, and unified absorption. Now, the other ones that go outside of mind, note that, because that's different in the next diagram. And I want to show you suffering. Suffering is there. Suffering exists because of negative energy dominance, and suffering comes in the form of, see these arrows going down here, emotional absorption and thought absorption. That's what suffering is. That will be different on the next diagram as well. And the other thing to show you is that suffering that gets absorbed into the source. Do you see that phrase there? Can you see my cursor? Do you see that phrase? Contaminated love triggers akashic imbalance. So love is a huge part of this diagram. It's a huge part of the source of the universe. It's very important. It's not just an emotion. It is an emotion, but it's set apart from the other emotions. It's hugely important. And suffering actually causes contaminated love. Well, the love that comes through is contaminated because of the suffering. And then that actually causes an akashic imbalance. And that's what causes the whole imbalance in this diagram, which causes the negative energy imbalance eventually. That's what causes this imbalance here. You see the red part there, which is positive, the black part there, which is negative. There's an imbalance there. The red one is much bigger and the black one is very small. And of course, that gets translated into manifestation, but there's a mirror image. So it's actually the negative energy which becomes dominant throughout the universe. And that eventually causes suffering through the journey of life and the evolving emotions. And then we go round and round and round. And the universe is in a constant state of suffering, because that suffering causes contaminated love, and then it causes the negative imbalance in Acacia, and so on. So let's go to the other diagram and show you the difference in a self-realized universe. And when I say self-realized universe, I'm talking about in people, in conscious beings in the universe, that's the only way that the universe can be in a self-realized state. There's no source out there somewhere else that's self-realized. It's in people, it's in you. This is where it happens. So, a couple of things that we were looking at before. If we zoom in here, the different types of absorption that go through mind. Well, there's only 4 now. Sorry, there was 4 before. Sorry, there's only 4 in total. So there aren't any of the absorptions that go outside of mind, because this diagram is all about what happens in self-realization through mind. So you've still got the unified absorption route on the right. You've still got the sensory absorption route, which doesn't change, because as you go through self-realization, your senses still stay the same, still coming through the material body senses. But these two change. For example, here, the emotions, you don't feel emotions anymore. What you do feel is ekatosha. Ekatosha is different. So your emotion engine and your emotion cycle disappears completely, and you develop ekatosha absorption. Now, what is ekatosha? It's these 3 characteristics there. Love as a base, ekatosha as a base, and then out of that is built enthusiasm, bliss, and joy. And those are the 4 things that you experience after that, and in different combinations and different forms. And because you are feeling unconditional love triggers akashic balance. So instead of creating an imbalance in akasha, it creates the duality in a balanced state. That's why it's a different color. These circles are a different color. They're not black and red anymore. So it all looks nicer and more pleasant. So that akasha is generated without an imbalance, and then it's manifested into energy, and then we go round the circle without any contamination, without any suffering at all, and that creates a self-realized universe. And that's probably enough to talk about, to go through in this lesson, to be honest. Any other questions? All right, then. Should we call it a day? Lovely. Great. Have a good week. See you next week. Bye-bye.